A couple weeks ago, Ethiopia and Egypt had their second round of negotiations regarding the dam being built by Ethiopia. An agreement has yet to be reached and things aren't looking good, with both countries blaming each other. Egypt's Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation said the talks were unsuccessful due to Ethiopia's persistent refusal to accept any compromise. The Ethiopian Foreign Ministry accused Egypt of putting up roadblocks in the discussion that prevented any consensus. So for context, Ethiopia has built a dam on the Nile River known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, and it has nearly reached full completion. When complete, the dam is said to become the largest hydropowered dam in Africa. The Ethiopian government announced that the dam had begun generating power for the first time in February 2022, delivering 375 megawatts of electricity, and they announced in September of 2023 that the dam reservoirs have been fully filled. Egypt is not happy about this, believing the dam to be an existential threat to their country. Now, this isn't anything new. Both countries have been in disagreement over this dam for years, at least since 2011 when Ethiopia began construction on the dam. The dam has been something Ethiopia has wanted to do for a long time, since 1956 when Haile Selassie was the emperor, because Ethiopia believes the dam would help fix a lot of their problems. For example, up to 60% of Ethiopians don't have regular access to electricity, but the dam has enough hydropower energy to fully support the development of the whole country, both in rural and urban areas. The role of GERD will be to act as a stabilizing backbone of the Ethiopian national grid. This is due to the fact that it will be capable of producing more than 6,500 megawatts of power, which is enough for the whole 100 million plus population of Ethiopia, but also enough to export to neighboring countries as well, such as Djibouti and Sudan. Quote, "The newly generated electricity from the GERD could help revive an economy that has been devastated by the combined forces of a deadly war, rising fuel prices, and the COVID-19 pandemic," said Adisu Lashitu of the Brookings Institution in Washington. The dam cost a whopping $4 billion, and most of the cost was paid for independently by the Ethiopian government via bonds, as well as by the Ethiopian people through crowdfunding. Egypt and Sudan both see the dam as a risk to their safety, with Egypt in particular being worried about how the dam will affect how the river flows downstream, considering Egypt already struggles with little rainfall and 97% of their population relies on the Nile River for water. This is especially made clear when you look at the population density for Egypt and see that 95% of people live along the Nile or in the Nile Delta in the north, where the capital city of Cairo is located. Sudan also shares some concerns about water shortages that could result from the dam, leading to droughts in the country and affecting their agriculture. Ethiopia denies that the dam will have a negative impact on downstream water flows and contends that the dam will in fact increase water flows to Egypt by reducing evaporation on Lake Nasser. The reservoir, located in the temperate Ethiopian highlands and up to 140 meters deep, will experience considerably less evaporation than downstream reservoirs, such as Lake Nasser in Egypt, which loses 12% of its water flow due to evaporation as the water sits in the lake for 10 months. Through the controlled release of water from the reservoir to downstream, this could facilitate an increase of up to 5% in Egypt's water supply, and presumably that of Sudan as well. The previous Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, argued that the dam would not reduce water availability downstream and would also regulate water for irrigation. In May 2011, it was announced that Ethiopia would share blueprints for the dam with Egypt so that the downstream impact could be examined. Another concern for Egypt is not just the water, but the fertile silt that flows down the Nile into the soil and produces rich agriculture for Egypt, allowing them to be a top 5 agricultural producer in a dozen different agricultural products. The concern is that the dam will limit the silt, leading to less lucrative harvests. However, the dam will actually retain all the silt in the river, thus leading to an increase of the useful lifetime of dams in Egypt, such as the Aswan High Dam, and of the Rosieres Dam, the Sennar Dam, and the Merowe Dam in Sudan. Another concern of Egypt regarding the dam was that the filling of reservoirs would lead to water levels dropping dangerously low, which would negatively affect about 2 million Egyptian farmers and lead to Egyptian hydropower dropping by 25%. Ethiopia responded by pointing out that only 12% of Egypt's electricity comes from hydropower, which means a 25% decrease only accounts for a 3% decrease in overall power. Despite this, Ethiopia still offered to help by providing power if a compromise could be reached, yet Egypt refused. However, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the reservoir filling was just completed and none of Egypt's concerns ever came to fruition. Egypt is very opposed to this dam and has been since the very beginning. For example, in 1978, when Ethiopia was considering building the dam with Soviet backing, the Egyptian president at the time, Anwar el-Sadat, responded by threatening war, saying, quote, "We are not going to wait to die of thirst in Egypt, we'll go to Ethiopia and die there instead." And again in 2010, Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak was recorded threatening to bomb any new Ethiopian dam. And in 2013, Egyptian politicians, chaired by Egypt's president Mohamed Morsi, were reportedly caught proposing anti-Ethiopia sabotage plans after a closed-door meeting was broadcast live on air without their knowledge. Sudan has been less consistent on their attitude towards the dam, in the beginning siding completely with Egypt, but in 2012 Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir said he supported the building of the dam, and in 2014 Sudan accused Egypt of, quote, inflaming the situation. However, now as of 2021, Sudan has been back to being antagonistic since the overthrow of its president Omar al-Bashir. So I explained the background of the situation and discussed why Egypt is so staunchly opposed to the dam. However, there's another reason that I haven't mentioned. Another reason that may be the actual reason why Egypt doesn't want the GERD to exist. Entitlement. The Nile River is the largest river in the world, and if we go back in history, it has always been associated with Egypt, because Egypt has been the dominant regional power for quite some time. But if you look at the map, the Nile runs through 9 other countries, not just Egypt. It is fed by 2 different rivers, the White Nile that begins in the Great African Lakes, and the Blue Nile that begins in the Ethiopian highlands in Lake Tana. These rivers converge in Sudan and flow all the way down to Egypt. In 1929, Egypt signed a treaty with colonial power Britain called the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. The Anglo-Egyptian Treaty covered many issues related to the Nile River and its tributaries. Of particular relevance is that it granted Egypt an annual water allocation of 48 billion cubic meters and Sudan 4 billion cubic meters out of an estimated average annual yield of 84 billion cubic meters. In addition, the 1929 agreement granted Egypt veto power over construction projects on the Nile River. In 1959, Egypt and the independent Sudan signed a bilateral agreement which effectively reinforced the provisions of the 1929 treaty. The 1959 agreement increased water allocations to both Egypt and Sudan. Egypt's water allocation was raised from 48 to 55.5 billion cubic meters, and Sudan's from 4 to 18.5 billion cubic meters, leaving 10 billion cubic meters to account for seepage and evaporation, leaving nothing to the remaining 8 countries to use for themselves. The treaty did not make any allowance for the water needs of the other riparian states, including even Ethiopia, whose highlands supply 85% of the water that flows into the Nile. A Nile treaty signed by the upper riparian states in 2010, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, has not been signed by either Egypt or Sudan, as they claim it violates the 1959 treaty. Yet Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia have argued that they are not bound by these agreements because they were never included in them to begin with. Now that Ethiopia wants to utilize its resource and develop itself for future prosperity, Egypt is looking to make sure this doesn't happen by maintaining full control of a river that is not theirs. In 2014, the 3 nations agreed to set up a tripartite national committee meeting over the dam. The first TNC meeting occurred in 2014 from September 20th to the 22nd in Ethiopia, and in 2018 Abiy Ahmed met with the Egyptian president, promising that Ethiopia would never want to hurt Egypt when the 2 countries have such a long history together. However, none of these meetings made any leeway. In October 2019, Abiy warned that, quote, "No force can stop Ethiopia from building a dam. If there is a need to go to war, we could get millions readied." Egypt has tried to get America involved by overseeing negotiations. However, tons of Ethiopians criticize the American government for being biased and unfair when it comes to the dam. In February 2020, the U.S. Treasury Department stated that final testing and filling should not take place without an agreement, after Ethiopia skipped U.S. talks with Egypt over the dam dispute. Ethiopians online expressed anger using the hashtag #ItIsMyDam over what they claim was the U.S. and the World Bank siding with Egypt, contrary to the co-observer rule initially promised.
It's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way, and they'll end up blowing up the dam. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear, they'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something because they could have stopped it. They should have stopped it long before it was started. I said, how do you let it get built and then you say they have a dam?
Abiy Ahmed responded that, quote, Ethiopia will not cave into aggression of any kind, and that threats were misguided, unproductive, and clear violations of international law. In September of 2020, the United States suspended part of its economic assistance to Ethiopia due to the lack of sufficient progress in negotiations with Sudan and Egypt over the construction of the dam. In April 2021, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi warned, quote, I am telling our brothers in Ethiopia, let's not reach the point where you touch a drop of Egypt's water because all options are open. During Joe Biden's July 2022 meeting in the Middle East, he met with Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and restated American support for Egypt's water security and forging a diplomatic resolution that would achieve the interest of all parties. A few months later, Biden issued a statement affirming U.S. commitment to protecting Egypt's water supply. And recently, about a month ago, American Senator Bob Menendez, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was exposed and charged for conspiring for years to act as an agent of the Egyptian government, while he held a powerful role in shaping U.S. foreign policy. The indictment says a conspiracy occurred from January 2018 to June 2022, alleging that Menendez promised to take and took a series of acts on behalf of Egypt, including on behalf of Egyptian military and intelligence officials. It said he conspired to do so with his wife Nadine and a business associate. The same Bob Menendez who in September of 2022 criticized the Biden administration for hesitating to impose sanctions on the government of Ethiopia, where, quote, many atrocities and war crimes were committed in the civil war between the government and the rebels. This explains why many Ethiopians have little faith in America when it comes to mediating this conflict, when corrupt politicians like him are being paid to work against interest of Ethiopia and its independence. With the dam being scheduled for completion in 2024, Egypt is running out of time. Since a compromise is seemingly impossible for them to come to with Ethiopia, the potential for war is multiplied by 100. War is a real possibility, and if worse comes to worse, a war over the Nile would be a major global event in 2024, considering the region plays a huge role in global stability. Egypt does have a larger military personnel and better air force, which they can use to blow up the dam that is only 40 meters away from the Sudan border. If this happens, $4 billion in over a decade of work went down the drain, and Ethiopia will have no choice but to retaliate. So far, Egypt has been threatening war repeatedly, but has yet to do anything, with Ethiopia continuing on with no fear. But Egypt refuses to compromise because they don't want the dam fully functional at all, so they may finally attack as a last resort. Ideally, the situation can end in peace with a resolution being attained. However, we will see what happens in 2024.